Hello, beautiful people.
And welcome to Ask Zajef, Yoimiya edition. First things first, overall power level, how Yoimiya measures up against Diluc, Klee, Yanfei, Xiangling, and Hu Tao. Okay, so we're not gonna compare to Xiangling, because any unit you compare to Xiangling is just gonna be so far behind when it comes to like Pyro Carries, because Xiangling does as much damage as them, but she does it without needing to be on field, so you have so much more flexibility in units you can use, and rotations. And also, Xiangling's a good support for a bunch of teams as well. And hell, maybe you just want to have 2 Pyro Carries. You do not need 2 Pyro Carries. This used to be a thing that people said back in 1.0, because floor 12 had the pyro damage bonus, and we didn't know back then that the Abyss would change, and that it wouldn't just always stay the same bonus, right? We didn't know that back then, but the game is actually very well balanced in terms of the multiple different archetypes that you can play, and you do not need 2 Pyro Carries. So if you're considering rolling for Yoimiya, that's completely okay. We'll get into the pros and cons later, but just make sure that it's for the right reasons, right? It shouldn't be because I need a Pyro Carry and I have nothing, because you don't have nothing. You have something. You have Xiangling. She is arguably the best Pyro Carry anyways. If it's, I don't like Xiangling and I want to get another Pyro Carry, that's completely okay. But it is important to mention Xiangling for units like these, because many people think that they need to get a Pyro Carry because they don't understand how good Xiangling is. And then when the next banner rolls around, it's a unit they'd want, but they don't have the Primo Gems anymore because they spent all their Primo Gems on Yoimiya. And then they're like, well, fuck, what do I do now? Leads people to spend... I've made it pretty clear in previous videos what I think about the fucking monetization system in gacha games. I think it's fucking cringe. I think it's predatory. That being said, that doesn't mean you can't go for her, and that doesn't mean she's not good. Right? The reason I'm insisting on this is because I don't want someone to pull for her and then regret it. Especially not because of my video. With that out of the way, right, we're not really going to be pairing Yoimiya to Xiangling for the rest of the video, but we're probably going to draw some comparisons to Hu Tao and the other Pyro Carries. So, Yoimiya is basically... Oh, I'll wait for the ad to be done. If you're not adging right now, type Joel. I love it. I'll keep going, right? In terms of single target, again, not including Xiangling, Yoimiya will be the second best. The best one being Hu Tao. Hu Tao is harder to play, but even if you don't do your cancels on Hu Tao, as long as you're vaping your charge attack, you're not forgetting to use your Xingqiu Burst, Hu Tao will be doing more damage than Yoimiya. When it comes to AoE, well, every other Pyro Carry will be better than her. So yeah, so the question is, how much do you value the higher single target output versus the basically inability to do AoE? And the answer to that is, honestly, it kind of depends on what team you're building. If you're building a vape team, like in AoE, you wouldn't really go for any of these units anyways. You'd stick to Xiangling. And so the idea of, well, you can play Xiangling on one side and Yoimiya on the other side comes into play. When that's the case, it kind of makes it easier for you to make sure that you put Yoimiya against the right matchups. Because Xiangling is a very versatile carry that can be very good in single target and in AoE, you can look at your chamber and be like, well, maybe this one's not a great example. You look at your chamber and be like, oh, okay, if I want to 3-star this chamber, I can put my Xiangling on the second side and my Yoimiya on the first side. I don't really see much value in Yanfei, Diluc, and Klee when other units can really do what they do better all the time. Whereas Yoimiya and Hu Tao, there is value to having them on your account in terms of like actually increasing the ceiling, the speed at which you can kill stuff. Even though Yoimiya is kind of useless in AoE, I still consider her to be more valuable than Diluc, Klee, and Yanfei. I think she's like definitely above them. And okay, I mean, I guess that leads into the next question, which is advantages and disadvantages of Yoimiya teams, mainly over Hu Tao teams. Okay, effectively, right, in terms of personal damage, Hu Tao is actually like quite a bit ahead. Hu Tao will do anywhere, if played decently, between 20 and 40% more DPS. But personal damage isn't all there is. Personal damage isn't all there is to a unit. Yeah, Hu Tao is like pretty significantly ahead in terms of personal damage. But because the other units in your team are also doing a pretty significant portion of your damage, it's not quite as big when it comes to how quickly your teams will be able to clear. That gap out of the way, the practical difference can actually be very different from that. Because the way that Yoimiya's damage distribution works is when you play her in a vape team, which generally you should, what happens is normally you'll vape hit number 1, you'll hit number 4, which is the 3-hit damage, because the first hit hits twice, and you'll hit number 7, which is the 5-hit damage number. This is what she usually gets, and this is where I'm basing this 20 to 40% behind Hu Tao, right? But What happens if you have to cancel your attacks? Or you get hit by an enemy? Well, what happens in those situations is not only do you not get the biggest portion of your fucking damage, which is your last hit, but then on top of that, if you cancel on the wrong hit, your ICD gets fucked. 1, 2, 3. As you can see, our last hit, instead of hitting for 10k because it vaped, it hit for 5k because it didn't fucking vape. Because of the way that we were on internal cooldown, what ended up happening is we got false, false, true, false, false, true, false. Right? Went from 1k to 850. It was a 15% damage loss. But that's on top of the fact that on our first one, instead of being able to get all the way to the last shot, which is most of your damage, you had to cancel early. All of this to say, Yoimiya, when she starts her 5-hit combo, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if she doesn't make it to the 5th hit, her damage fucking tanks. If one of the shots missed the enemy, her damage massively tanks. Because of that, she can't be too far from enemies, because if she's too far, her shots are sometimes gonna miss. So she's not really ranged. And then on top of that, you have a massive incentive to run her with a shielder. Because if you don't have a shielder, you'll have to dodge, and if you have to dodge, on Yoimiya, unlike on a bunch of other units, oh, got a dodge, lost your 5th hit, and fucked your ICD. When you compare that to Hu Tao, Hu Tao's charge attack doesn't have ICD, and it's where most of her damage comes from. All that's potentially preventing you from reaching Hu Tao's, like, hypothetical damage output is how well you play her. As a general rule, if you're considering both Hu Tao and Yoimiya, if you're willing to learn the cancels on Hu Tao will do significantly better in almost everything. Whereas Yoimiya can work everywhere and is a lot easier to play. You still have those issues that you can run into where if you don't have a shield, you'll need to dodge, but if you have a shield, she's really easy to play. And there's a few matchups where Yoimiya's range is very relevant. I'm aware that there's a very vocal community that really likes Yoimiya. If that's you, and you're watching this video and you're like, I like her, but I don't want to like get a unit and then be forced not to play them because they're bad. That's not the case. You don't have to worry about that. Yoimiya is good. Just because she's not as good as Hu Tao doesn't mean she's not good. There's Yoimiya the character and there's Yoimiya the unit, right? If you don't like Yoimiya the character, you probably shouldn't roll for Yoimiya. But if you do like Yoimiya the character, you won't have to worry about Yoimiya the unit being useless, because she's not useless. She won't be useless. I hope that gets everything out of the way when it comes to power level and advantages and disadvantages versus other teams. We can go into specific Yoimiya teams, though. One of the things that she's actually pretty good at is she has pretty good teams that don't use Bennett. The core of a Yoimiya team in general is Yoimiya Hydro Shield. When you're running Toma, it lets you run an animal unit as your last slot. And when you're running Zhongli, you have a few options. You can run Bennett for the damage buff on Yoimiya, Fischl for a bunch of personal damage, or you can use Yun Jin. And Yun Jin is actually a very synergistic character with Yoimiya. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but you can actually use Yelan instead of Xingqiu with Yoimiya. Because Yoimiya applies less pyro than Hu Tao, Yelan's Hydro application is actually enough. Those will generally be the Yoimiya teams that you'll see. But if you're willing to reset when you get cancelled, or if you're willing to just have to accept that sometimes you won't get your last hit, then you can skip over the shielder slot, right? You can go for no defensive options at all, or pseudo-defensive options like Xingqiu, and rely only on that. I mean, honestly, at that point, you can mix and match anything, just make sure that you don't have 2 pyro appliers if you don't have 2 Hydro. But you can basically mix and match between Yun Jin, Fischl, Yelan, and then finally, if you're specifically running Yelan and Xingqiu, you can run XIANGLINGS. Those are not the only Yoimiya teams. This is strictly the vape Yoimiya teams. You'll always be able to use Yoimiya just like you'd use another pyro unit in a non-vape team, but I don't think she's ever the best option for those teams, so we're not going to spend too much time on them. I'm not going to go through all the options you have. If you want to play Yoimiya teams, you can do them nonetheless. Hi YouTube, this is following day Zajef. I'm just here to add some like caveats to what I said about the vaporize stuff. I do think indeed that vaporize is like very important for Yoimiya, but there can be some situations where going for a vape team with Xingqiu will increase your rotation's length, right? Because Yoimiya's cooldown is 18 seconds, whereas Xingqiu's cooldown on his E, which you need to do every rotation if you want to get your energy back, is 21 seconds, and if you go Sack Sword, it goes up to 22 something, and can even be 23, right? So effectively, right, you're extending your rotation by between 3 and 5 seconds by using Xingqiu. In teams where you don't use Xingqiu, right, the advantage is if you stick to only units that have 15 or 18 second cooldown, you'll be able to get your rotations faster, but it is very, very difficult to do all of the things you need for a rotation in 18 seconds. But if you really like Yoimiya, you want to practice her rotations, you can get her rotations down to like basically frame perfect. You can start using mix and match combinations of characters that we mentioned earlier. You can stick to like something like, for example, Yoimiya, Bennett, Yun Jin, Zhongli. And because your longest cooldown in this team is 18 seconds, you get 18 second rotations if you play them perfectly. That being said though, the damage per rotation is going to be a lot lower. So you actually need to do your rotations fast in order to actually have this team be competitive with others. And even then, it's not going to be competitive with the better vaporized teams. It's just going to be an okay thing, right? I don't want you to like have the takeaway from my video being that if you don't have a Xingqiu available for your Yoimiya, you can't use her, because that's not the case. You definitely still can. These three questions should basically be like the biggest, or these two questions should be like the biggest part of the video. Are our cancels worth the effort? I'd say if you're running Yun Jin and you have C6 Yun Jin, there's a better argument for it because you can actually get all the way to your N3, which is gonna vape. But honestly, it's really not necessary. Not even close to as necessary as Hu Tao's cancel. Brief myth-busting on some general misconceptions floating around her, such as her ICD supposedly being her biggest issue, yeah. Let's take a look at how much of her damage is coming from vaped attacks and how much of her damage is coming from unvaped attacks. When she's vaping, 63% of her damage is coming from vapes. If you start getting a little bit of EM, in reasonable ranges, because Yoimiya doesn't want like only EM, it starts getting up to like 70%. If you compare it to someone like Hu Tao, it is less. But does that mean it's bad? Well, what would happen if she didn't have ICD? And all of this were true? Wow! You're gaining, what, 20% DPS? A little bit over 20%? Wow! That's massive, right? So you're applying 7 sources of Pyro in like less than 3 seconds? Are you sure that's a good idea? How are you getting enough Hydro to vape all of this? You won't. You won't. If there was no ICD at all, but the speed at which she's attacking, she'd just yoink the Hydro Aura away, and you'd be stuck with a Pyro Aura. Biggest thing that matters for internal cooldown for vaporized carries is that their big hits are the ones that trigger reactions. And as you can see, right, if you look at the base motion value, what are the 2 biggest hits for Yoimiya? The 3 hit, which is hit number 4, and the 5 hit, which is hit number 7, which are both hits that vape. And so honestly, ICD is not nearly as big as a problem for Yoimiya as many people seem to think. Are there any other big misconceptions? Like that's the biggest one. Her old stuff. Oh yeah, there's that as well. Yoimiya's elemental burst is bad. I think that's pretty clear. The question is it so bad that you don't want to use it? Or is it just something that you use, something that's part of your kit, but it doesn't really bring you much? And the answer to that is, unfortunately, as it often is in Genshin Impact, it depends. I would say that not using your burst is generally not the best idea. Yeah, like the burst is a reasonable portion of her damage. It's far from the majority, but it's still a reasonable portion. Her burst also gives attack to the rest of her team, which means that with specific supports that deal with that buff, it can be better. Her burst can also be used to set up certain rotations. Sometimes you'll need to use a second Pyro if you want to make a good rotation, but that's not necessarily the case. The way that it works with Yelan is because she applies 2 units of Hydro with her burst, Yoimiya's burst doesn't fully remove it, and then Kazuha's burst will swirl Hydro and then swirl Pyro, and his E will swirl Pyro. I don't actually know if I swirled Pyro there. Yeah. I waited too long because I was fucking talking and words hard. That's the idea. And then with Xingqiu, what you're doing is you don't have 2 Hydro, so your Yoimiya burst will always remove whatever Hydro you have. So what you do is you walk into the enemy for the orbitals to actually hit them. And then you can do the same thing. The reason why you do this is because, well, in a team like this, the Hydro unit's doing a pretty big portion of the damage, so being able to get a Hydro Swirl and a Pyro Swirl instead of just a Hydro Swirl or just a Pyro Swirl is pretty important. In general, her burst is okay. You can either go for Shimenawas, not really focus on your burst, or not go for Shimenawas and use your burst whenever it's available. Not during your E though. Never use your burst in the middle of your E unless it's like you need the iframes. Is Yun Jin good for her even before C6? Yes, Yun Jin is good for her even before C6. I haven't done a lot of math on Yun Jin, I'm not entirely sure, but basically 15% damage percent, increase the level of your burst, which is more damage, more defense, which is more damage, more attack speed, which effectively very rarely actually makes a difference. So you got a lot of decent Constellation. Like the difference between C6 Yun Jin and C0 Yun Jin is noticeable because you have C2 and C3 and C4. The difference between C5 and C6 is barely noticeable. Quick talent priority overview, normal attack.
You still have a special place in my heart.
Yoimiya's talent overview, talent priority is normal attack first by a law. Level normal attack first, and honestly, like you want normal attack level 9 before you want like E level 8. Weapon overview. Yoimiya has 3 weapons. That's it. She has 3 weapons. Thundering Pulse is her best in slot. If you don't have Thundering Pulse, you can go High Refined Rust or Aqua Simulacra. And if you don't have either of those, you go Slingshot. That's it. That's the fucking weapon overview. I'm not going really further than that. The difference between Slingshot and Thundering Pulse here, 20%. Here, 17%. It's in the realm of 15 to at most 30%, which is honestly not as much as the difference between free-to-play option and signature 5-star on a bunch of other characters. Pulse is like an okay weapon in general. It's okay, but Rust and Slingshot are so good that you really don't need it. And with the fucking weapon banner we have for Thundering Pulse, I would recommend to stay as far away from it as you humanly can. Artifact comparison. Don't go Lava Walker unless you're in Monopyro. In Monopyro, sure, go Lava Walker, I guess. Echoes, The Echoes of an Offering set, this cooldown doesn't start when your attack hits the enemy, it starts when your attack deals damage to an enemy. But whereas hit happens on the client side, damage happens on the server side, which means if you have high ping, this cooldown effectively becomes bigger. From what I understand, it seems like 30 ping is basically the highest you can have for this to actually work with Yoimiya. Shiminawa, Rotating Bolide is meh. Honestly, like, my best advice is, as a general rule, Yoimiya doesn't have a signature set. Yoimiya doesn't have a great set. Can tailor your set towards what exactly you're doing. If you're playing a team where you don't care about your burst, have good Shiminawa's pieces, you can go 4-piece Shiminawa's. If you're playing Vape with Fischl, an over-vape team, then you really want Crimson Witch. Same for Retracing Bolide when you have a shield. It's meh. But because it's dependent on you keeping your shield and the shield not expiring, I don't like it as much as the other options. As a general rule for the artifacts, just go whatever. Constellation Overview and are they worth? Is it worth? No. Don't spend money on this shit game. Cover them seriously. That's the burst, 4 more seconds. And when you kill an enemy, you gain 20% attack. Basically, 25% power damage. That's her E, right? This is fucking terrible. You go from 161 to 170, which is, so it's a 5% DPS increase for 400 bucks. Same reason why TF isn't great. Your buffs will run out anyways. Her burst isn't amazing, and it will definitely change the timings. It's not a nerf. As long as you can keep enough Hydro Aura, you won't lose vapes from it. Is it worth the fucking like 1,000, 2,000 bucks it costs to get there? Fuck no. I think the biggest problem with Yoimiya C6 is her constellations along the way to C6 are very underwhelming. Because she's a character that basically doesn't gain shit from C3 and C5. So even if you go all the way to C6, right? Sure, her C6 by itself is okay, but then you compare that to a character that actually has good constellations along the way. You look at something like Yelan, where her C1 is useful. Her C2 is really good. C3 is a pretty large amount of damage. Her C4 is pretty useful. C5 is not very good, and her C6 is pretty strong, right? She actually has a few good constellations. I'm not saying you should go for constellations on Yelan. Fuck constellations, fuck spending money on this game. But if you are like saving up your primitives, or you just want to spend money, right? Like I'm not gonna stop you. Yoimiya is probably not the best one to go for. How does her E skill multiplier work, and how does Yun Jin's buff interact with it? Basically, you gain your E bonus only on your normal attacks multiplier. And stuff like Yun Jin's buff don't actually gain the bonus from her E. It's a little bit unfortunate. Is attack speed valuable on her, and if so, at what point does it fall off? Not really. Right, like I said, C6 Yun Jin is okay, but the reason why Yun Jin C6 is good for Yoimiya is because Yun Jin is good for Yoimiya. You wouldn't go out of your way to give Yoimiya a unit that gave her attack speed just because it gave her attack speed. The reality is, attack speed is kind of a shit stat. Attack speed is a bad stat that really doesn't increase your damage by much. Kazuha Sucrose better for her VV Vape Teams double swirl setups. They're both okay. Honestly, there's not much of a difference, but because Kazuha has more personal damage, and because your vape team with Yoimiya doesn't have AoE other than Kazuha, I would probably generally recommend Kazuha over Sucrose. It's not a big difference though. Does Fischl still steal some vapes when Yoimiya with paired with a C2 Yelanchi? Still can. To begin with, Fischl doesn't steal enough vapes from Yoimiya to not be a good unit. Like, the amount of vapes that she steals is small enough that she's still a very good option for Yoimiya. How badly does Yoimiya get affected by auto-targeting? It depends on the enemy, really. And right now it's not moving, so it's fine. But as soon as it starts moving... Oh. When you're really, really melee range, it's okay, but here... Oh. Oh, we missed one. That's an enemy that's as massive as the Primo shot, and we're still missing some. It'll happen multiple times during your play session. You'll notice it multiple times, and personally, it's one of the reasons why I don't like playing her, because I notice it and I'm just like, fuck, I hate this. Are her charge attacks worthless? Yes. Her charge attacks are really bad. Look at how slow it takes to actually get the whole thing. And what do you get for it? 26%? 3 of these is less than your first normal attack. It's really not good. She have any synergy with Raiden to help her energy problem. Her burst isn't good enough to justify running Raiden with her. Both Raiden and Yoimiya want a pretty large amount of on-field time, so running both of them extends your rotations, and most importantly, XIANGLING would do more damage. Like, at that point, when you're playing Raiden with Yoimiya, like, you're playing a Raiden team. Does she gain anything relevant from Dendro release? No. She doesn't. Not a single fucking thing. Technically, she does. If you want to know exactly what the reactions do, I have 2 videos on that out already, so you guys can go check that out. I'm sure we can include that in the description. Quicken / aggravate / spread. If you apply Pyro, you'll burn off the Quicken aura, which just makes it completely not viable. Well, if you have Hyper Bloom, you don't want Pyro. That rules out Hyper Bloom. And so that leaves us with Burning, which doesn't really do a lot of damage and prevents you from vaping, and Burgeon. The thing about Burgeon is you need to hit the seeds. And how are you hitting the seeds? In order to hit the seeds, you have to target the seeds, and if you're targeting the seeds, you're not targeting the enemy. If you hit the seed once, it'll delay your ICD, and it'll completely fuck up your vapes. Overall, I think that she actually is one of the few units that will not see play with any of the 3.0 Dendro units that have been leaked so far.